Hello and welcome. My name is Kirk Munro, and today I'm going to talk to you about a new feature that we've been working on that allows you to add lifecycle actions to a lab that you have in your organization. So this feature is a personal favorite of mine. I really like it because what this feature does is it allows you to take labs that you're working on that maybe work with virtual machines, maybe they work with some cloud resources, and integrate different other functionality from outside of the lab into your lab environment, so into your lab profile. Gary, hello. This was actually Kirk, not Brian. Brian's out sick today, so I was asked to step in and do the demo. So yeah, I'm doing it in his stead, but I will pass along the hello. So what I've got in front of me here is a lab profile that uses this new lifecycle actions feature, and I want to show you guys what that looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to launch this lab just so you can see the end product and see the new feature in action. So this is just going to take a second to fire up a lab environment. Now the lab, this one's pretty simple. It's just got one Windows 10 VM and nothing else in it, but it still will take a minute just to provision that VM on the back end and then serve it up to me inside of my web browser. Once that's done, you're going to see some interesting things showing up. So in this case, the lab has been modified to send notifications into the student who is using that lab. And those notifications can contain text that, well, whatever text that you want to communicate to that student. That's one of the features that we can do through these lifecycle actions. Because when you're dealing with a lab, there's an entire lab lifecycle that you work with. There's actions for when the lab is being created versus when it's actually been fully created, when the lab's ready for use, when you save the lab, when you restore the lab, when you shut the lab down. I should close my Teams. And so that allows you to, let me just get this out of the way, there. So those notifications and those events allow you to do a bunch of different things at various stages of when the lab is being used. So I apologize for the pop-up. I forgot to close Teams down before I started this. So now that I've got my lab up and running, you see here there's this window saying the lab is running, proceed as you will. And the reason that shows up in this lab is because of these lifecycle events. Let me just jump back for a second, and I'm going to go to the actual lab profile and show you how it works to actually edit this content. So I flip over to edit so I can look at my edit profile. All of the features that I'm talking about today inside of your lab, they all exist in your lab profile, and they're all under the advanced tab. And so if I hop over here to the advanced tab and I scroll down, down near the bottom, there is a new section called Lifecycle Actions. And so there's a little pop-up here that tells you that you can define actions at various points in the lab lifecycle. And there's an example there as well. And so here you can see in this lab, I have a few actions. I've got one that triggers when the lab is actually running, one that triggers when the lab is saving, and then I can add additional actions. And you can have as many actions as you want in your lab. There's a whole lot of scenarios where this is useful. Some examples. Maybe you have a lab that's going to work with resources that are out inside of some cloud service. I don't know what service that would be, but maybe there's some company out there that offers a solution online, and you want to dynamically create an account for the student in that solution online and serve that up to the student so they can use that inside of their lab. Well, because you want that created dynamically so that it's unique and only available to the student, you could use lifecycle actions for that sort of thing. Another example, and this is actually a real example that we use, we have labs where they have public IP addresses. And when those public IP addresses are assigned, we also do some setup of some DNS entries behind the scenes for those labs. And so those DNS entry assignments happen as part of the lifecycle actions, as created for those labs. That actually goes and creates the entries in DNS, and then sends a notification to the student saying your DNS records are ready and here's what they are, so you can actually use them in the lab. So there's lots of interesting things you can do with these. Let me jump right into the lifecycle action UI so you can see all the capabilities of this feature. So the way a lifecycle action is broken down is you have the actual action that you're going to take, and there are 4 different types that we support at the moment. So you can send a web request. Sending a web request is when you would want to call an API external to Lab on Demand. So I mentioned the scenario where you've got some web service and you would want to create an account. Well, if that web service has an API that you can invoke to actually do that work for you, you can actually make that call. Or maybe you want to make a bunch of calls. Maybe you want to do something a little bit more complicated. Well, we're now in the world where Microsoft Azure supports Azure Functions and the whole notion of serverless computing. I could create a lab that has a web request, and that triggers based on a lifecycle action, and that web request goes and calls into Azure to an Azure function. And behind the scenes, that function does a whole lot of different stuff, and maybe it sends a notification back to my lab as part of its work. And that's where you can have one web request do a whole bunch of different things because you call out to Azure to do that work. So that's about calling APIs somewhere on the web. And then they're sending notifications to the user. And so that's what this is. In this case, a notification was sent at a certain point in time during the lab lifecycle to the user. And Brian typed this up, and so that's why it says Brian is great, and Brian is great. So that's actually true. But that's where that comes from. This is Brian's test lab, and he's got an event that actually sends this into the user just to remind them that Brian is in fact great. And so that's the notification lab. And as you change these, you'll notice that the options down below switch depending on what you're doing. So if you're sending a web request, you need to enter the URL that you're calling and the type of verb you're using for the web request and some details about how you pass through that information to the web request. If you're sending a message to the user, well, in that case, you just need, you may want a name. You don't need it, but a name for the message. That's used when you would want to have a message that you update over time. So I could give a name to my message, and at different life cycle events during my lab, update the text in that by using the same name, and it'll actually replace that notification for the user versus just typing in text down here in the bottom saying hello user, and I can send a message off to my student and say hello when they come into the lab. So that's what notifications are about. Email is actually sending an email to the user. You can give it a subject line for the email message as well as the body of your email down below, and that will send an email to the user. So maybe at the end of a lab, you want to thank the student and send them an email with some additional resources for further learning or with references to other recommended courses based on them having completed this course or that kind of thing. So you can do that inside of these lifecycle events. And then the fourth one is executing a machine command. And this one's kind of cool because this one allows you to, at a certain point in time, you can actually run, tell the virtual machine to actually do something. So I'll get to the point in time here first. So for these different requests, you pick the type of action that you want to take. So maybe you want to send a notification to the user. And then when do you want to do that? When do you want to take that action? Well, that's the event. And so if you look here, there's building and built. So this is as the lab is being built, because when you first launch a lab, behind the scenes, it needs to go and create the virtual machines and stand up all of that infrastructure that the lab's going to use. So that's during the building phase. Once the infrastructure is the lab's been created, then the lab is built. And so that's that built event. And then there's running. That's the point where, so when the lab is built, Well, then the virtual machines have to launch. And then when those virtual machines launch, they eventually get to a point where they have what's known as a heartbeat. Basically, they're ready to be used and logged on as. Well, when that heartbeat happens, that's when this running phase happens. So that's when the lab is actually ready to used by the student. IP addresses assigned is a special event that is invoked whenever IP addresses in a lab, so for public IP addresses, whenever those are assigned or whenever they are changed, because you may save a lab and then come back in later on and your addresses expire and so they have to be refreshed, and when they refresh and are updated, you can actually handle that because there's a notification for that, and so we have an event built on top of that you can do things with. Saving is when you indicate, okay, I'm going to save my lab. So the lab is in the process of saving versus, okay, the lab is now in a saved state. So that's the saved event. You come back to a saved lab later on and you resume that lab. So when you start the resume process, it's resuming versus when the lab is resumed and it's available and you're using it, that's the resumed event. And then similarly, there's tiering. Most of these are pairs, you can see. Saving, saved, resuming, resumed. And tiering down is when you're done. Okay, I finished my lab, so I indicate that I want the lab to close. The lab starts tearing down, and then torn down. The lab is actually completely torn down in the back end, and it's all done. So you can pick any of these events. The events that are available to you are depend on the actual type of action that you have. So, for example, if I pick machine command, I can see that, actually that's not the right example. Is it notifications? No, that's not the right example either. But at any rate, I can pick my action that I want to use. So I can pick, I want to send a web request, so it's going to call it IP, or I want to send a notification, and I can say hello user. And so in this case, maybe I just want to say hello to the user when they resume the lab. So I can come down here and pick resumed. And at the point that the lab is resumed and presented to the user, I can have it say hello, welcome back as a notification, and hit OK. And then that adds that particular action to my lab. So there were already actions for running. So when the lab is running and saving, when you click on saving, it would actually go through and send a notification as well, based on how Brian configured this lab. And then there's the third one that I just added, so when they go back to a resume state, it's going to welcome them back. Because I already have this lab running, for me to see that change that I just made, I would have to exit and come out of the lab. But that's how these events are configured. And something else I should call out is if you're familiar with our labs and you're used to when you come to our virtual machine and the student's going to log in, and you can go to the virtual machine and you can paste in their password, and you see this little paste icon. So I can click on that to log into the lab environment with the student by pasting in their password. Well, we have that same paste icon support inside of notifications. And so what that allows me to do is communicate information to the user that they're going to use in their lab, and they can actually paste it in. So if I come here inside of my VM and I open up Notepad, I apologize for the size of this. I made the screen bigger so it's easier to read, but I'm sacrificing some real estate right now on my VM as a result. But at any rate, I'm inside of Notepad, and I want to paste in Brian is great. I can just come over here and click on paste, and there it goes and puts that content in Notepad for me. So if you wanted to send information at a point in time to students using your lab that you want them to be able to paste into that lab, well, that's possible. And the way that works is in my notification text, we have this special syntax that you can use. And that's what right here. So paste text. So if you put an open curly brace with the word paste text, then anything after that up to the closing curly brace will be the text that you can actually paste in for the student to use. So that's just how you can actually pass them stuff in that they don't have to retype it. Maybe it's a password, maybe it's something for a, I mentioned the scenario where you create a remote resource and maybe you want to pass them the password for that resource. Well, you can actually pass that password in using paste text so that they can then paste that into a web UI and actually log into that lab without retyping it, that kind of thing. Now, a few other things worth highlighting inside of these actions. In this case, I've got a delay for this action, so it's only going to happen after 15 seconds from when this event triggers. So in this case, the action says, I want to send a notification to the user when the lab is running, but it doesn't do it exactly when the lab is running. It waits 15 seconds. There's a delay, so you can play with that and set a delay based on the experience that you want to give to the user. And it uses a name, lab running notice. The reason why you would use a name is because if I come here, I've got this content and it's in a toast window, which I can close. I can come back to previous notifications by clicking on this email icon at the top. And so here it shows the notification I received. You don't see a name here, but the student, so as a student, I don't see a name, but this notification is named. And if I had to change the information in that text, I just need to send a new notification from a different event with the same name, and it would actually update this rather than adding an additional entry. And so we actually support the notion of notifications where you actually want to make a change to what's in there. And so in the case of, I talked about when you're creating DNS records, how the DNS records change over time. In the labs where we use that, and I'll show you that in just a minute, I tell the student what the DNS records are via a notification, and then later on, if the DNS records are changed because the IP address itself changed, I can just update that notification, and they don't have to wonder which one do I use. They just have one notification message with their DNS records, so you can control how that communicates. There's an error action, and by the way, I'm not showing you these, but so there's great help information in here. This describes what all of the actual events are. This tells you the details about name and how that works, about how delay works. So there's these cool tooltips that provide information explaining the content, and so that'll help you along. Error action is useful because you might want to notify the user on error, or you might want to end the lab because maybe what you're doing in your action is trying to create some resource that's required by the lab, and the lab simply can't be used without it. And so in that case, you might want to just end the lab because the lab creation failed because you're trying to call out to something in the cloud and you're trying to create some resource and the lab's not usable without it. So you can actually end the lab because that didn't work. So there's just different things you can do based on what happens with your errors. And then of course you can enable or disable actions in a lab. So if you're working on actions, you can keep them disabled while you work with the details for them, and then enable them when you're ready for them to be used by a student. So I'm going to leave that with the settings as they were. And certain events make more sense at certain times and other ones don't. So this right here, Brian in his lab created a saving event. So on saving, send a notification to the user. But that's a bit of a challenge, because if I'm saving my lab, how is the student going to get the notification? Because they're going into a saving state. So if I come here and I want to save and close this lab, so let's do that. Yeah, I want to save and close it. And so that's great. I can close my window. I didn't get the notification because the notification is communicated to the user through the lab itself. But it's still sent. I just didn't see it yet. So if I cancel out here and I come back to my lab details and I click on resume, it's going to go back into my lab environment. And so, and any notifications that were sent during events where they couldn't be readily displayed to the student, I can come into my notification history, and here you can see that second notification showed up saying the lab is in the process of saving, and there's the toast. So we even show the pop-up for notifications that could not be displayed because the lab was not in a state where the notification was displayable. The pop-up will show up when they come back to a working state, and they can of course review the contents inside of the notifications tab should they dismiss the toast. And so that's how that works. And so you don't see, in this case, you don't see the resumed notification, that message that I added saying welcome them back, because the lab was launched before I added that, so that lab only has the events that were available at that point in time. If I close this lab and then I relaunch a brand new instance of the lab, that it will take the notifications, it'll take the events based on how they're configured at that point in time. And so in that case, on resume, I would see the actual toast show up for the resume notification here as well. Now I'm going to cancel this lab, and yes, I want to cancel it, close out my window, and I'm going to show you another example that's not just sending notifications. So I've got a lab that I've worked on that's dealing with that public IP DNS management. And so if I launch this lab, it's going to take a second to spin up. And what it's going to do is it'll launch a lab, which again just has one VM. That VM has a public IP address. But the public IP address doesn't get assigned right away when the lab is launched. It takes a minute for that to happen and then for that to be recognized by the event system. So if I go into the details here, into edit, again to the advanced tab, scroll down to my lifecycle actions. I have an action here that is when the lab is building, I want to actually send a web request out to a Azure function, and I want to on error notify the user about it. And so in this case, I'm just calling some function that's going to do some updating of DNS records when the lab is building. And then if I come down further in my lab environment and I go to on tearing down, I want to go and remove those DNS records because they're only temporary. So you could do different things, right? So in this case, I'm working with resources that are out in some cloud service, and I want to create those resources on launch, and I want to tear down those resources on completion. And so that's what I'm doing right now using building. This is not using that special notification because I actually created this before. This is an older lab. I created this before we had the IP addresses assigned event working, but that's fine. So this is just going to go and set up my DNS records for me because I've got a cloud service that will monitor this lab for when the IP addresses are assigned, and when the IP addresses actually do get assigned, send a notification to the user. So if I click on password here to log in, and I go to my desktop, eventually I will see a notification pop up here saying the IP address has been assigned. Here are your DNS records, and those DNS records are passed in to the notification using the paste text special qualifier that I showed you. You could use notifications that allow me to then paste that into something else. Maybe I want to copy and paste the full DNS name into Internet Explorer and browse to it if it's a web lab that uses a web page, or however they're using the DNS records. I just wanted them to be able to paste them in. So that's how that works. I'll leave that run in the background. Now, I just need to quick jump over to something and see if I got questions. So there don't seem to be any right now. If there are questions, by the way, feel free to chime in at any time, and I will respond to them. So the only comment I have there is one from Greg, but if you leave comments, I see those show up right off the bat, and I can answer those questions. So now, still waiting for that notification to take up. It takes a little while because in this case, the lab waits basically up to 2 minutes for the IP address to be created. And then once that's created, then it would, then it'll be detected and create the DNS records on the back end and send a notification into the lab environment for the student that the IP addresses are ready for use. So while that's running, let me just jump back into, I'm going to show you one more lab. So let me go to here and back to the details, and do I have it set up inside of this environment? No, actually don't have it set up right there. I have it in another test environment, but so I'll leave that for another time. At any rate, that pretty much wraps up the capabilities of this feature. Something that would be great, and I mean, we already have the one comment here. You guys can leave us comments on our Facebook page or contact us through various means that you can contact us. I would love to know what kind of things you would like to do with this, how you would like to integrate services via this feature. I've been using it, as I mentioned, for DNS registration, and you can use it for creation of resources in cloud environments and sending notifications. And I'm very curious to find out what you think of it and what you would like to do, and have those discussions to make sure that it suits your needs. Right now it's pretty broad and covers a lot of the bases, so I think it's quite capable feature. I did just think of one last detail I do want to highlight, and so I'm going to go into the details here for when you're dealing with web requests. There are a few things that are worth pointing out just inside of the properties. And again, we have tooltips explaining each of these. But I just want to show you a couple of things. So one thing you can do is indicate, is it a blocking call or not? So that'll indicate, is there maybe when your lab is starting up and you go and you create those cloud resources, you don't want the lab available, you don't want that action to finish until your work is done. So in this case, I'm calling out to a web request, and it's not going to, the lab will not continue building until my call is completed. And so that's where you can use blocking or not, whether you want your call to go out and block the creation of the lab, or do you just want to make a call and something's going to happen in the background while your lab continues to work. If you want it to just happen in the background, you can just uncheck that blocking call, and it'll do it while the lab continues to go and build out. So that's something I find particularly useful when I'm dealing with calling out to REST APIs. And depending on what you're working with, you'll need to read the documentation and figure out what type of verb it is required for the API, maybe some header information if it requires authentication headers that you need to pass in. That's based on documentation you'll need from whatever you're actually working with. Again, we support delays, so you can delay after a certain period of time, just like we can with notifications, messages going to the user, and error actions. You can decide how you want those to be processed as well. But each of these types, if I go back to adding new action, each of the types that you're going to use, email, we show you help wherever there should be help to describe how the things are going to be, how the things are going to be used. Same thing for when you're going to invoke a command. Oh, and yeah, one important detail about invoking a command. Note this comment: for the machine command to be run successfully, the user has to be logged into the VM, and the VM must have the Lab on Demand integration services installed. And that's because of currently the way we run PowerShell inside of a virtual machine is we talk through our Lab on Demand integration services. So if you want to set this up for a lab where once the lab is ready for the student, you want to run some PowerShell script, or you want to run, there's different types of commands. You maybe just want to run something in command.exe. You can do all of that. Just make sure you have the Lab on Demand integration services installed, and make sure you don't do it until the student is actually logged in. So you may want to have the lab resume from a saved state so that the user is logged in right off the bat, or maybe you want to deal with a delay so you give enough time for the user to log in before you do the work. There's different ways you can approach that. But that's up to you to decide and figure out how that works for you. Thank you very much for connecting with us. I hope this was useful for you. Feel free to reach out to Brian or myself and come back to us with questions and feedback if you want more information about this feature.